Welcome back to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Props, and for last year's Dragon Con, one of the armor sets that I had put together for the show was from one of my all-time favorite movies, Starship Troopers, and I didn't have any plans on taking it back this year. That was until I heard there was going to be a decent-sized group of troopers, and a bunch of them had used my free armor templates to put their sets together. So needless to say, I had to represent. But if I was going to take the armor set back, there were a couple of upgrades that I wanted to do. So last year I had made the armor and I'd made a foam helmet of the M3. And it turned out fine, but I had purchased a resin cast kit from my buddy Sean and I wanted to put that together and make it hero grade. Also, I wanted to print off a Marita and finish that up. So this tutorial is going to be more about finishing techniques, especially for like resin cast kits or if you're 3D printing props. Now, if you want to make the foam armor, I still have free PDF files available over on my website that you can download to make your own. Also, I have links for the jacket in the description section of that video as well. So, I want to show you what it takes to put a resin cast M3 and a Marita together. Let's go ahead and get started. Last year I made the M3 helmet and it turned out fine, but my buddy Sean was making some resin cast kits and I picked one up as a costume upgrade. Now when it comes to kits like this, you have to do a lot of the work yourself to get it to where you want. Luckily for me, I've worked on hundreds of resin props over the years. Now one of the big things to keep in mind is that resin dust is extremely fine and it gets everywhere. So all the cleanup I do to remove flashing on this helmet is going to be done in my sanding station. And I'm utilizing cutting wheels and sanding drums on my rotary tool. These help me get rid of all of the excess material and get it down to the base shape that I need. Now another thing I'm doing with this helmet is making it grade A, which requires the ear vents to be drilled out, and I'll be adding a microphone later on. And here you can see I'm using a Forstner bit to cut through the side of the helmet. Now on this particular kit, I have some mold lines on the front and the back that need to be cleaned up. I start by removing as much material as I can with a hobby blade before moving on to sanding. And because I'm going to repaint this entire helmet, I go ahead and sand the entire surface to get rid of that gloss. Now the helmet itself is already pretty smooth, so I'm not using an aggressive sandpaper at this point. And after a light pass, I can move on to my next step, which will require some wet sanding. I start off by using a 400 grit, and one trick that I like to use is to wrap it around a tongue depressor. After that, I'll move up to a 1200, and I'll go over the entire surface of the helmet. This will make the entire helmet extremely smooth, and it will prep it for paint. To paint the helmet, I'm going to be using a rattle can of Valspar dark gray. After the paint had been thoroughly allowed to dry, I could then add my gloss coat. And for the gloss, I wanted a texture, and to achieve that, I hold the can a little bit further away, so that the particles actually have a chance to dry before it reaches the surface. This kit came with some rubber cheek guards, but if you're 3D printing one of these helmets, you could make these pieces out of foam, like I did on my original helmet. I scuff up the interior and the rubber using a hobby knife. Then I can glue these into place using some Bob Smith superglue and a little bit of accelerator. The superglue holds onto this rubber really well, so I shouldn't have any issues of these ever coming off. To make this helmet comfortable, I do have several boxes of random helmet pads. These are just random insert pads that I'd buy off of Amazon or I'd pick up at thrift stores. I think these pads were for a baseball helmet, but you can see they work great for this application. They do come with these little stick-on dots, so you can replace the pads, but I don't ever plan on taking them out. So I'm going to use some SureBonder high-temp Cosplay hot glue. After the top of the helmet had been taken care of, I can now start to work on the back and the sides. For these areas, I'm going to be using some 1-inch upholstery foam that's been cut into strips. And just like the other pieces, these are also going to be hot glued into place. Now I would recommend do not use a low temp hot glue for this application. Because the amount of heat that your head gives off and can be trapped inside the helmet, that could make low temp hot glues fail. For the ear vents, I found a company on Etsy that makes identical ones to the movie. Now they only come in gold, but I could easily paint them black. The hole I drilled was a little bit too big for the stem, but it's an easy fix by just wrapping it in some 2mm foam. Plus super gluing the foam to the resin is definitely going to hold better than if I had just glued the metal directly to the resin. Sean's kit did also come with some leather and foam for the chin strap, so I glued the foam to the backside of the leather and then pulled the two sides down to the middle. The leather makes a nice little addition to this helmet, but if you don't have this, you could just make it out of foam like I did in my other helmet tutorial. Sean also included some snaps for either side. To make sure that these don't pull away when taking the chin strap off, I did the double adhesive method of super glue and hot glue. These could then be attached to the back side of the cheek guards. The leather strips could then be fed through each one of the straps and pressed into place. To make it a grade A, it also needs a microphone, and I'm going to be making mine from scratch using some wooden dowels. Luckily, I'd already made one before, so I was able to measure and replicate many of the steps. I was able to sand down the profile of the dowel using some sanding sponges and pen knives. The stem of the mic will be made using a bamboo skewer. Before I trim it down, I decided to go ahead and add my base coat using some Valspar Gloss Black. I could then tape off the mic and part of the stem and then spray on some antique nickel. I could then drill into the helmet with the diameter of the bamboo skewer and then glue this into place. So with my ear vents and mic, it takes it from a stunt grade to a hero grade A. But it looks a little too clean for Klendathu, so I'm going to add some Fuller's Earth Dust. This is going to be applied to the helmet using a makeup powder brush. And do put some papers down because this dust goes everywhere. Next up, I'm going to be putting together the Marita. This weapon was printed on my Bamboo X1 Carbon, and it's a file from April Storm Props that I was able to find online. I sliced this in Bamboo Studio and added keys. It's a fairly large weapon, coming in at approximately 42 inches in length. So after I determined that the fits were good, I could start gluing it together. And the first thing to do is prep the interior cuts with a foot sander. This is going to help rough up the surface and make gluing it together a lot stronger bond. To attach the individual sections, I'm using more of that Bob Smith super glue. It works great on PLA and I haven't had any issues of it failing. Now when it comes to printing and actually having it look good, attaching all the pieces is part 1, but we all know part 2 is the most difficult, and that is prepping the surface. Because let's be honest, seeing a 3D printed prop and knowing right off the bat that you can tell it's definitely 3D printed, nobody likes that. So take your time with the prep. The first thing I'm doing is using a heat tool with a spade bit to weld my lines together. Now you may not have to do this, but I personally think that it helps with the overall stability of the prop. Next up, I prep the surface with some 2-in-1 filler and some Krylon Red Oxide. The red primer is used to see where I've sanded, because the PLA and the filler are both gray. And now here comes the tedious task of sanding the surface smooth. But here you can actually see those print lines and what that filler is doing. Next up, I'm going to be using some 3M glazing putty to smooth out my seams even more. This will be left to dry, and after it is cured, I can go back with that foot sander and sand everything smooth. More hand sanding and wet sanding is done to prep the entire weapon for my next color, and that's going to be some Rust-Oleum Camo Green. The weapon in the end will be green, so this is just acting as a base coat for that. Also because the camo paint is a little bit tougher than the filler primer and the red oxide. And even though you're seeing multiple colors on that surface is extremely smooth. One final coat of the green and some gloss, and we're on to hand painting and weathering. Liquitex Heavy Body Mars Black is going to be used as an initial wash over the entire surface. Of course, this will allow some of the paint to get down to the details, but it also preps the surface for any additional acrylics. And I do have multiple images of the Marita from Prop Store up on my monitor for reference. The shotgun pump and the end of the Marita were also painted with some Mars Black. The black is being used on some of these areas as a base, so that when additional metallics are placed on top, it makes them pop. For my metallics, I'm going to be using some Liquitex Heavy Body Iridescent Rich Silver. This will be applied to several parts of the weapon using a filbert brush. And remember, because it's a metallic, no water is added. I don't want to disperse the metallic flakes any more than necessary. For the weathering on this, I'm using a sanding sponge, and I'm looking for high points or the spots that are most exposed. This is where reference images definitely come in handy, especially for the stunt rifles. To knock this prop up a notch, I'm going to be using some real rivets. Using a 1-2-3 block as a placeholder, I could use a wooden mallet and knock out the nail, leaving the rivet head behind. I could then go through and drill out all the areas on the weapon where the rivets will be inserted, using a little bit of super glue and making sure not to get it anywhere else. Each one of these rivet heads could then be carefully pressed into place. To match the movie, I also need to add a shoulder strap, and I found a replacement strap that's similar on Amazon. To attach it, I'm going to insert some little eyelet screws into the body of the weapon. Small pilot holes were drilled, and then each one of the screws could be tightened down. The strap could then be attached, and a little bit of the earth dust was applied to this prop as well. A couple other props that I had made for this costume, but I did not have time to film them because I was literally building them the day before I left for DragonCon at warp speed. One of them being Radshak's hand. Now this was a 3D file as well from my buddy Sean. He had this commission, and I'll have a link for this down in the video description for the Etsy. Now if you do build it, you're going to be doing a lot of resizing for the different fingers because everybody's hands are different, and depending on what glove you get, it's going to be kind of a pain in the butt, just a heads up. One of the other things that I had made was the throwing knife and a pouch for it, and this was made out of some MDF, and this is like the old school way of making things, right? Not 3D printing them, just pulling out some MDF and throwing something together quick. Another one of the props that I was really proud of was Sugar's necklace. I built this in like no time at all, but it's one of those little Easter eggs that calls back. So if you're a fan of the movie, you definitely recognize little things like that that are on the costume. So hopefully you enjoyed this entire tutorial series. If you are making any of this and using my tips and tricks or using any of the free templates, be sure to tag me at SKS Props on Twitter and Instagram because I love seeing your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best. HD Foam.